That's why I can't find the link.
Good evening, and before I do the welcomes, the system's crashed, and therefore we have a protocol whether we want to continue the meeting while they reboot the system or wait. My preference is that we start the business, and we can always actually get it rebooted otherwise, because how long is it going to take to reboot, we don't know. Exactly. So all those in favour of starting the meeting? Okay, we'll start the meeting. We could do, but then we'd have to throw out people and then have to bring them back, and it becomes a little bit muddy. So good evening, and welcome to the Cabinet meeting on Thursday, the 18th of January 2024. As it's the first Cabinet meeting of the new year, I suppose I should wish everybody assembled a happy new year, even though it's the 18th of January. I think we can just about get it in. Do we have any apologies for absence?
No apologies for absence.
Thank you. Do we have any declarations of interest apart from the obvious dual-hatted ones? Councillor Henry.
Thank you, Chairman. In relation to item 9, I am a director of Sempra Homes, and upon advice from Council, I will have to absent myself from the meeting.
For that item, as opposed to the meeting in general? Yeah, because we will miss you. Yeah. I will look forward to seeing you go when the item arises then. Can I confirm the minutes of the meeting of the Cabinet meeting held on 7th of December 2023? Just a general assent. Yeah, okay, thank you. So I'll sign those meetings later. We're moving on to item 4, the Cabinet Work Programme, which is on page 13 of the agenda. As you can see. Councillor Webb, did you want to comment on the work programme?
Thank you, Chair. No, just note on the 8th of February, the Pitsea Community Diagnostic Centre is coming up for a progress on the delivery. I'd be obviously very interested to hear what the update is on that, because it has gone pretty quiet as of late. Thank you.
We're all interested, Councillor Webb, and I'm sure the people of Pitsea are even more interested, so look forward to when it comes. Moving on then to item 5, this is Brook House on page 15 to 50 of your agenda, and this is Councillor Schrader.
Thank you very much, Leader. As colleagues will recall, this administration previously allocated £5 million for the refurbishment of Brook House. This was the first time any such budget had been allocated for this work, and upon taking over the portfolio in 2021, I tasked officers with putting together a refurbishment plan. This was originally slated to begin in 2022, following planning permission being secured in June of that year. This work was to have taken place with the residents in situ. Unfortunately, as outlined in the report before you, once we conducted the more intrusive pre-construction surveys, it quickly became apparent the complexity of the works required meant £5 million was simply insufficient. To be clear, the surveys revealed issues needing to be dealt with that would have been impossible to foresee until those surveys were undertaken, so there's no way the officers could have known. Officers have now produced a detailed specification for the works needed to bring Brook House back to an acceptable standard, and this has been costed at £16 million, allowing for some contingency. Whilst we've stretched every sinew to try and find a practicable way to carry out these works without moving the residents, this has proved impossible. The advice of the fire service is that we should empty the building. As I advised full council in December, given the current void rates in our properties, I anticipate this will take approximately 2 years to achieve, although we have now moved at least one household, and I'm hopeful we may find opportunities to accelerate the decant where possible. We've now reached a point of decision, colleagues. We're out of road, and I don't believe we can delay these works any longer. The residents of Brook House have waited quite long enough. We need to start this process now so that the works can be undertaken expeditiously. Brook House is a Grade 2 listed heritage asset, and under the terms of the new Building Safety Act, would currently be classed as at risk, which imposes additional responsibilities upon us as a landlord and potentially severe penalties if we fail to act. I shan't withhold from colleagues that this has been a difficult decision. £16 million is an eye-watering sum of money from the Housing Revenue Account. As you can see in the report, I tasked officers with an exhaustive examination of every conceivable alternative, and all options have been thoroughly examined. Ultimately, we can't be certain we'd be able to obtain the necessary compulsory purchase orders or Secretary of State approval for disposal, and all the alternatives would take time we don't have, and entail significant additional cost to the council. So, as imperfect as it may be, the option I'm recommending tonight, I believe, represents the most financially prudent course of action for the council, and the one most likely to offer, finally, some resolution for the hard put upon residents of Brook House, who have had to endure the deteriorating condition of the building for far too long. Officers are confident these works will render the building and its 84 social housing units fit for habitation for at least another 30 years. In the meantime, I want to say that I fully appreciate the difficult and frustrating situation the residents of Brook House now find themselves in. I'm sorry that the refurb programme did not pan out as we would have hoped, and I wish that I could provide them the kind of certainty they're looking for, because I totally get it. They all want to know when they'll be moved and where they'll be moved to. But unfortunately, the reality is it's simply impossible. It's impossible for me to say at this stage. But officers will be taking a measured and managed approach to the decant. All residents will be having one-on-one conversations with officers about their individual housing needs. All I can promise is that our officers will support the residents throughout the process. We will endeavour to keep them informed while finding suitable alternative accommodation and putting in place a package of support. I want to thank residents for their patience. It has been a very trying time for them. We've set up a dedicated web page for Brook House on the council website, and there's an FAQ section to try and address some of the residents' concerns. Colleagues, the recommendation can be found on page 16 of your agenda. I commend them to Cabinet. I'm happy to try and answer any questions. Thank you, Leader.
Thank you, Councillor Schrader. Councillor Webb.
Thank you, Chair. I'd just like to start by saying, if on approaching Brook House, some may be minded by the architectural brilliance of Sir Basil Spence. However, this view is drastically altered once you enter the building. You'll be forgiven for thinking you had entered a film set for a dystopian scene. Dimly lit corridors, cracked tiles, walls needed revitalising, and water ingress through walkways. Of course, residents deserve to live in better surroundings than this, and refurbishing Brook House has long been an issue, largely due to the costs involved with the Grade 2 listed building. But now it's time to end the procrastination on this. As already mentioned, the previous administration had set aside a budget to administer this, and this has been sat on for quite a while now, largely due to COVID, interrupting proceedings there. And now we're in the situation of rising costs and construction costs. We're in this ballpark of £14 million. There are a number of issues that I'd like to address regarding the report, which I think needs further clarification in places. We are now in the ballpark of, obviously, new building safety regulations. And obviously they came in 2022, and further requirements were needed up to the end of 2023 regarding high-rise developments. There would have been the building safety regulator would have been aware of the Brook House and as a registration, and also a month later would have been aware of the actual key building information. On the back of this, it's now listed as high risk, which further emphasises the need for immediate work. Going back to the cost implications, there's mentioned that it cost £14 million, 16 million with contingencies. What are the costed contingencies? That would be helpful to know. And the breakdown of each of the refurbishment costs involved here as well. The other concern, of course, is costs to leaseholders at the moment. They're expected to be significant. It must be an idea of what that bill will amount to. And in particular, for the individual leaseholders, they must be feeling in a vulnerable position right now. And they will want to know what these costs are likely to be in order for them to make an informed choice on their options going forward. Have Swan indicated they wish to continue with their leasehold arrangement on their 10 properties within the scheme? That's not mentioned. I'd also like to have further clarification from the building safety regulator as to what high risk actually means in the respect to Brook House. Also, what is the actual time frame for schedule for the Canting Brook House residents, and how are they being kept informed? I think obviously Councillor Schrader has touched on that already. And what reassurances are given that their housing needs requirements are being addressed? Now, when we come to page 21, there are a number of options here to be considered. And there is an opportunity for the use of social housing. And I'm wondering how far that has been looked into at this stage as a viability. The recommendation, of course, is for option 3, which will maintain the status quo in regard to tenure. The other options will require a compulsory purchase order. Are there any known obstructions that would make this difficult with discussions held with leaseholders thus far? Thank you.
Well, I thank Councillor Webb for his questions. Yeah, I have to be honest, I'm not an unalloyed admirer of Sir Basil Spence's work myself, as he knows, but it is a Grade 2 listed building, and he knows I take those designations very seriously, so it is an important heritage asset. He's quite right that the interior of the building is in a poor state in parts, and it's kind of sad as well, because you can kind of see what it was all supposed to look like, and because it was originally supposed to be executive housing for big bods from Ford's or something, as I understand it, and you can kind of see that once upon a time it would have been a very, very smart building. So it's apart from anything else, it's just really sad to see it in the condition that it's currently in. But he's quite right in the sense that, you know, costs have been a big issue with this, clearly for a protracted period of time, and now we've sort of hit this perfect storm of, you know, issues with, you know, we had everything gummed up with COVID, and then we've had the Ukraine and everything since then. But as I said in my earlier remarks, I think we've kicked the can down the road as far as it can go. We're out of road now, and I think that the time has come to bite the bullet and get this done, because we can't go on as we are. In terms of his specific questions around the new building safety regs and the high risk designation and some of the costage contingencies, I'll defer to Mr. Tizard, who is the man in the know with these things. In terms of the time frame for decanting, as I said at full council and as I said a moment ago, it's going to be a very long and quite tricky process, because obviously we've got 84 units and we've got to match all of those up with alternative accommodation that meets their housing needs. But I'm reassured that the team are having those conversations directly with the tenants, and the officers may be able to say a bit more about the strategy moving forward. But I do know that all the tenants were written to in the last week or earlier this week. There, the day the agenda was published, we did write to all the tenants, and obviously we'll write to them again depending on the outcome of the decision at this meeting, so probably first thing tomorrow. But I'll hand over to the officers to say a bit more. Thank you.
Yeah, so in terms of the Building Safety Act, at-risk buildings, anything over 7 stories or 18 metres. So obviously Brook House and Acorn House are our 2 at-risk buildings. That just means there's more regulations around the management of those, including things like personal evacuation plans for residents, and how we engage with residents, and just making sure the building is fit for purpose. As you know, Brook House with 1 staircase and fire compartmentation issues is not necessarily fit for that act at this point in time. Anything else on the Building Safety Act I can clear up? There was another question for me.
Yes, it didn't really give any firm description of what at risk, although it says it's actually rather confusing in the report. On one page it says at risk, I think on the first couple of pages. And then further on into the report, it actually describes it as high risk. So there's a bit of confusion there. It doesn't actually address what you actually mean by high risk, as far as the regulations are concerned. And how does Brook House fit into that high risk category?
So it's at risk is the classification under the Building Safety Act, and that's just anything over 7 stories residential. So that's just a technical term to describe, and it has to be registered with the Building Safety Regulator. It will be inspected, etc. So that's a technical term, just nothing to do with high risk. I'm not sure, top of my head, where we've described it as high risk, but obviously the age of the components, etc. It would probably fall into high risk at some point if we don't do anything.
It's page 33 under threats.
Just to assist, yeah, it is in on page 33. It does say, as Brook House is a high-risk building, as defined in the Building Safety Act, etc., all works defined in the Building Safety Act 2022 would be subject to the Building Safety Regulator as being satisfied with compliance with the Act. So I think I see what Councillor Webb is driving at. It's the definition under the relevant act. But why would it be classed as at risk? I know you said it's any building over 7 stories or whatever, but what defines the risk, if you like, to that particular building?
This is just in response to Grenfell. It should say at risk. Sorry, that's not high risk. So apologies for the confusion. The risk tables obviously weren't subject to the same scrutiny from my point of view. So apologies. It's just a response to Grenfell in terms of high buildings. Obviously, it's not, a 6-story building with 1 staircase would still technically be high risk, but it's not at risk under the Act. So it's just a cut-off. And at some point, they'll probably reduce that to 4 stories. Also, we're told. So it's literally just a function of the legislation that came out.
Councillor Rimmer.
No, again, I commend the work of officers and my colleague, Councillor Schrader, on this. And actually, I think, if anything, he's the one who's definitely not procrastinating. And I'm sorry, but the last administration did procrastinate. They were more concerned about pigeon deterrence measures and trying to pull down community centres and build monster-sized tower blocks than actually helping restore Brook House. So is rather rich. And actually, Councillor Schrader has actually grabbed the bull by the horns and is actually dealing with this, much to his credit. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Rimmer. Just 2 points from me. I think that we ultimately have to remember these are real human beings living in a estate, albeit a high-rise estate, who are now in a position where they don't know when they're going to move, they don't know where they're going to move to, all the human-sized things that come with it, like, simple things like how do you organise our post, how do you organise letting people know where we are and everything else. And it's absolutely vital that we are on point with any communications we do. I know that we've had this conversation, Councillor Schrader and officers and so this will be old news to some of you, but I think on the record here, on the public record, we need to make sure that we get our communication with those residents and our engagement with those residents absolutely on point, so that they are getting their questions answered, they don't get any false news or false information coming from different sources, because unfortunately there have been some people that have used Brook House as a political football or an attempt to actually scare the public for whatever reason, and we need to be professional and statesmanlike in administration in ensuring that the right thing is done for the residents from now right the way through to the point where that building has been decanted and is empty. I also think, and I have a concern, and I have raised this with officers, that £16 million, you're absolutely right, is an eye-watering amount. But what we have seen over the last 2 years with projects across the country and in Basildon specifically, where cost escalation on projects has occurred, where supply chain has broken down, leading to additional costs. We've seen the likes of developers that were going to be building in the town centre that have failed to even put a spade in the ground because of the escalating costs. And there is only so much money the HRA can actually bring in to bear on this project. I mean, already I think it's going to mean that we are going to have to curtail various other projects within HRA in order to actually meet the necessities of providing for Brook House. If it escalates too much, I am concerned that there might come a point where it becomes completely unviable to continue. And I think that I don't want to set hairs running, but I also think it is incumbent upon us to at least raise that as an issue, because if we don't, then in hindsight, and we all know that hindsight is 20/20 vision, if that occurs, and we haven't actually raised it as an issue to the residents and to the public at large, then quite rightfully they could say, well, hang on a minute, didn't you know that things might go up? Didn't you know that this was potentially on the horizon? We have to be honest with the residents. And so what we need to do is have a tight project management on it, which I know officers will do. We've got professional officers and I have faith in them. We need to manage the project efficiently. We need to be getting regular reviews as members, which I know Councillor Schrader will be on like a rash. We need to engage with residents, and we need to just be honest with them that if it looks like there is going to be a problem further down the road, that people are informed as soon as we possibly can. Because otherwise, we're just not being honest and having integrity with the residents that we deal with. Councillor Sargent.
Thank you, Leader. Just on your point, I just wondered if there could be some kind of helpline set up for the residents or dedicated email address so that if residents have got a particular concern, they can contact the right person at the right time and get the information they require. Thank you.
Mrs O'Shea.
Thanks, Leader. So we've got a dedicated website for Brook House residents, and we have, as the Leader has described, written out several times newsletters to all residents in the block. I think once a decision is made tonight, we'll be writing to residents tomorrow, as Councillor Schrader said, to advise them what the decision is and what will happen next in broad terms. But at that point, I think a lot of the communications will be one-to-one. We've got a team of officers dedicated to working with residents in Brook House to make sure it is a smooth transition. The housing needs team have been working very hard, holding voids back, etc., so that once a decision is made, we have got some properties available for us, so that will immediately kick into play, and officers will start contacting residents on a one-to-one basis and talking to them about their individual circumstances and how we're going to move that. So potentially we could set up a helpline, but I don't envisage with that number of residents we would need to do so. I think probably once we've made contact with them, they'll have our direct contact anyway on an individual basis. So we'll be in touch with them very much on a bespoke.
Councillor Hadley.
Yeah, just a small point, Leader, and I couldn't agree more with what you articulated just now, but when people talk about at risk and high risk, and the officer alluded to the problems of Grenfell Tower. Grenfell Tower was a very special case. It was a clad building. To the best of my knowledge, there is no such cladding on Brook House. And under the previous Conservative administration, in conjunction with the fire service, Brook House was fully protected with a fire sprinkler system. And that was in advance of Grenfell. So I'd like confirmation that that system is still being maintained as in working order. And the reason I say that is historically, where a fire sprinkler system is installed in a building to the appropriate design and maintained properly, there's never been a loss of life in those buildings. So I think residents hearing at risk, high risk, may be panicked into thinking that somehow they're all going to die in their beds. This would be far from the truth if that system is being maintained properly. So I think in the communication with the residents, the use of terms like high risk and at risk need to be explained. I suspect at risk could be, if it's, my understanding is it's only part listed, its elements of the construction are listed as grade 2. Personally, I think if this wasn't a listed building, we would possibly be making a different decision. And I think in the communication with those residents, we do need, picking up on what Councillor Webb said, to explain what at-risk and high-risk means and try and, inform them that they're no more at risk tomorrow than they were yesterday.
Mrs O'Shea.
I think to pick up that point, we are very, very, very aware of that, and in all the correspondence that we've sent out so far, we have reiterated that point really about, this is not, people are not at risk, absolutely not at risk. The building is safe, and we have stated that many, many times. So, yeah.
Yes, I think Councillor Headley's made a good point, and I'll probably be very unpopular with the Echo. The Echo has been a little bit sort of fast and loose with some of its reporting and the way it's covered it. It's been a bit sensationalist, it's been a bit scary, so it is important that we do get messaging absolutely right, as I said, and also explain to people when we start to throw around technical terms like at risk and high risk, what it actually means specifically to living human beings in a building trying to get about their lives. Is the fire protection system still in place? We have that confirmation.
And just as a supplementary, Leader, with your indulgence, I don't believe, although the building regs have changed, I don't believe the RRO that was issued in 2005 has changed, and the responsible person for that building will be the Director of Housing. So if there was a loss of life, it would be the Director of Housing that would end up in court.
Mrs. O'Shea?
Yeah, just to add to that, under the Building Safety Act, there is a responsible officer. That's a member of Head of Compliance, my team, and the actual responsible person under that act is the body corporate, the council. And the reason it was mentioned in the report is just that if we kept Brook House as is and something happened, you know, we would be in a lot of trouble because it's classed as an at-risk building under the Act, even if it's not a risky building, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Councillor Schreider, did you want to wind up?
Yeah, I'll just come back on a few points. It is unfortunate that this high risk thing came up on page 33. The terminology used in the Building Safety Act is at risk, and it should be remembered that the Building Safety Act came about as a direct consequence and was in effect a response to the awful tragedy at Grenfell. But I think Councillor Headley makes an important point, which is obviously that Brook House doesn't have the cladding, which was the main source of the disaster at Brook House, at Grenfell Tower, and Brook House does have the sprinkler system that Councillor Headley referred to, which was installed some years ago. The only other things I was going to pick up on, obviously you mentioned the communication with residents. I think that is key. That has historically, it's difficult because obviously the residents want regular updates and sometimes we don't always have new information. But I think now we move into this stage with the decant, that communication with the residents is going to be much more direct, much more one-on-one, because obviously we'll be drilling down into each household's individual housing needs, and they'll have a housing officer that will be supporting them through the process of the decant. The rising costs obviously is something we will have to keep a very close eye on. As you sort of alluded to, the HRA house build programme is taking a shellacking as a consequence, but like I say, I've reached the conclusion that this is something we have to do, and we have to do now. So we will keep it very tightly project managed, and I've got every faith in Mr. Tizard to keep a tight eye on everything. Yeah, I think that covers just about everything. Thank everybody for their comments. It is certainly one of the most challenging issues I've had to deal with since I've been in the portfolio. But I think we're at this point of decision, and I think we need to take the decision and get on and do it. That's my view. So I'm. Oh, and do you want to mention that? Yeah, Mrs. O'Shea will just mention a few words about the leaseholders.
I know you asked a specific question around leaseholders. So the report says, or we're asking for a delegated authority to speak to leaseholders. And one of the options potentially would be they may wish to sell their property back to the council. So we're not going in and forcing that issue. So it's not a CPO position, but will be a conversation. We have a strategic asset programme where we can buy properties back. We tend not to buy many properties back because we want to invest that money through our new build programme, because it provides much better value for money. But on occasions like this, when there are potential issues that that might be a way to resolve it, we would use that budget for that. So we will be having conversations with those individuals, and of course it needs to be good value for the council, and provide a solution for the leaseholder as well. So they're the conversations that we will take place. In terms of if a leaseholder wishes to remain in the property, what the costs, their individual costs will be, that will be dependent upon the contents of their lease. And obviously we have a number of different leases over a number of years. The property's been in different ownership and the leases have changed, so we would have to be looking at the lease to what each leaseholder will be responsible for. We've also got an agreed payment plan in place that Cabinet approved. I think it was last 2022 that was approved, which has got a range of payment options. So that, yeah, I sent you that, didn't you? I see. So you've got that. So that's in place as well.
Thank you, Mrs O'Shea. The recommendations are on page 16 of the agenda. All those in favour? That is carried. Thank you, members. And officers, good speed on now rolling it out and getting the residents of Brook House put into a good position. Item 6 on the agenda is the draft housing allocation scheme and consultation, which is on pages 51 to 169 of the agenda. And it's Councillor Schrader.
Thank you. Yeah, me again. The current allocation scheme was introduced in 2014 and most recently reviewed in 2022. It's designed to ensure we make best use of the limited social housing we have available to us to support the needs of our most vulnerable residents. The backdrop to all of this, as members will be aware, is the tsunami of need we are seeing for temporary accommodation. As it says in the report, last year councils in England spent £1.7 billion on temporary accommodation. In Basildon, as I've told Cabinet before, we're anticipating a £2 million spend on TA by the end of this financial year. This unprecedented demand for housing support is driving a coach and horses through our budget and putting incredible pressure on finite resources. To support those most in need, I'm proposing amendments to our current allocation scheme. This follows recommendations from the Local Government Association peer review last February to reduce the financial pressures on housing services. We want to incentivise downsizers by adopting a pragmatic approach to how we prioritise them and the types of properties they can bid on to help free up larger family-sized homes and generate that churn in our housing stock. We want to give additional priority to release bungalows to free up properties we need for disabled residents. We want to take a pragmatic approach to housing benefit overpayments, where payment plans are in place so that people can carry on bidding on properties. We want to create a homeless at home band to allow people to join the Home Seekers Register whilst living at home to relieve the necessity to house them in temporary accommodation. We need to revise our financial limits, which are about a decade out of date, and I want to thank Kirsty O'Connell for the in-depth analysis and work she's put into this. Finally, we want to increase the quota of family-sized homes restricted to transfer tenants, again, to generate that churn within our stock and help those who are overcrowded move more quickly. The lack of temporary accommodation in the borough is making us increasingly reliant on very expensive nightly lets, often in hotel or B&B accommodation outside the borough. So these are the potential changes to the allocation scheme that I believe can help relieve some of those pressures, generate that churn in our stock, and get more people housed more quickly and make better use of our limited resources. We're proposing to undertake a public consultation on the proposed amendments to the scheme and a further report detailing the outcome of that consultation and the proposed amended allocation scheme will then be brought back to Cabinet for a final consideration and approval. In the meantime, I recommend that Cabinet approves the public consultation as set out in the recommendation on page 52 of the agenda. Very happy to take questions. Thank you, Leader.
Thank you, Councillor Schrader. Councillor Webb.
Thank you, Chair. I think the main question on the back of what Councillor Schrader has just said is why has this been brought to Cabinet at this stage for discussion halfway through the public consultation process? The draft policy document has already been put to the tenant and leaseholder panel for consideration. And the recommendation here is obviously to approve proposed amendments. Have these amendments come, or any of the amendments come from the leaseholder representatives, for example? If not, is there any plans for them to go back for further discussion? The report notes that the current allocation scheme is working effectively. The issue here is the rising temporary housing costs, which is expected to reach 2 million in the next financial year. However, the proposals indicate a great deal of finger crossing at this stage, with no clear financial benefits, if any, for up to 2 years. On the Homeless at Home proposal, which is a form of, in my view, a registered sofa surfing, make it incumbent on friends and relatives to take up the slack. And although afforded priority housing on the register, properties appropriate to their needs will still need to be available in an ever-decreasing housing stock. It mentions downsizing, and regarding downsizing, encouraging residents to downsize in under-occupied housing, for example, as quoted, 4 beds to 2-bed properties, where there is limited choice, is not really an incentive. The real issue here is that we need to build more social housing. That's the bottom line. And I would pick up on an item that's on Appendix 6, which actually alludes to Brook House. Now, presumably, will this now apply to residents moving into Brook House following the refurbishment? Does that allude to that, or is that an existent policy within Brook House? Thank you.
Thank you for that. I'll defer to officers in terms of the different stages that it's been through. I gather it has been to the tenant and leaseholder panel. She's chomping at the bit, can't there.
It has. This is to go out for public consultation. So obviously we have done some consultation already. We've consulted on the proposed changes. As you say, it's been to tenant leaseholder panel. We will now go out to public consultation because, of course, there are people that aren't currently tenants that will have an interest in what the allocation scheme looks like going forward. So that's the next step, and we don't have the delegated authority to do that, so we need to come back to Cabinet to ask for authority to go out and do that public consultation. Obviously, it's a huge scheme with, enormous impact on the borough, and hence that's why we're seeking permission to go out and consult on the changes, and we will come back again with the outcome of the consultation.
Thank you for that. To return to some of Councillor Webb's other points, he's right, and as I said in my earlier remarks, the driver of all of this is the incredible rising cost in temporary accommodation. The limits, the levers that we have available to us to pull to make any kind of difference to that are quite limited. So it is likely that the financial benefits of doing a lot of this will take a while to trickle through. There's no silver bullet. There's no single panacea, something we do that solves all of our problems. These are all reasonable steps, along with, it's part of a suite of other things, because obviously we introduced the the charge for temporary accommodation at a previous meeting, and some of the other things, like we're looking at the sheltered housing, for example. Again, it's all about trying to generate more churn in our stock so that we can house people in our stock rather than putting them in temporary accommodation. So the homeless at home, for example, at the moment, in order to get on the housing register, you present as homeless. So you might be, say, staying with parents or a relative of some kind. I think I'm right in saying, the officers will correct me if I'm wrong. The vast majority of the people who present as homeless to the council are younger people from the borough who are presenting as homeless because of some sort of breakdown in their current housing arrangements. So it might be they live with a relative or they're staying with friends, and they present as homeless at the council, and then we house them. And as I say, increasingly, we are housing them in B&B hotel accommodation because it's the only type of accommodation we have available. We just don't have enough emergency housing. So the homeless at home is to try and create a situation where somebody doesn't have to be housed by the council just to get on the home seeker register. If they can maintain their current arrangements for a bit longer, we will increase their priority. I mean, you're quite right. We have to have a house to put them in, but we'll increase their priority and get them on the register without, hopefully, having to put them into that temporary accommodation. If we can maintain their current situation for a bit longer, it will relieve some of that pressure. And in terms of downsizing, again, he's absolutely right. There is very limited choice. But part of the problem at the moment, so say you are an older person or an older couple, and you're in a 4-bed house, and all the kids moved out years ago, but you've got a secure tenancy. And when you look at your options for downsizing, at the moment, you have a 1-bed need. So your options are what? A 1-bed maisonette somewhere? You're going to move from a 4-bed house to a 1-bed maisonette? I think that's a big leap for a lot of people, particularly because they tend to have a lot of stuff they don't want to get rid of. So what we've said is, let's take a pragmatic approach. Let's say, okay, you don't want to move to a 1-bed maisonette. What about a 2-bed property? Bit more room. So it's one room over their assessed housing need. That may, for a few of those people, be a bit more palatable. And so again, it's about taking that pragmatic approach that frees up that 4-bed property for a family who are currently stuck in an overcrowded situation. We're just trying to, these are the very limited levers we have to try and generate that churn in the stock and make better use of the housing that we have. He's absolutely right. The elephant in the room is that we need more social housing, and I'm trying to build as much as I can. But as we just discussed in the previous item, my options for doing that were already limited and are now even more limited because I'm having to curtail my HRA house build programme. So there are no, like I say, there's no silver bullet. There's no panacea that's going to fix all of this in one hit. But these, I think, the officers have worked really hard on this. We did have, like I say, the LGA peer review, which was really helpful, and this is the fruit of that labour. And there's no magical solutions in there, but I think these are some practical measures we can take that will generate that churn and will just help us relieve some of that pressure on the temporary accommodation. I think that covered everything, but if anyone else wants to jump in with anything, let me know.
Councillor Rimmer.
Thank you, Leader. I'm not too happy, and I've expressed this before with the report on this. Most of it, obviously, I agree with, and I obviously agree with the sentiment and not just the sentiment, but what you're looking to do in terms of people who are downsizing, dealing with the homeless at home. I agree 100% with all of that. My concern is I think we've been too generous with these income limits, and I think we've set on page 55 in that table. I think we started off with this assumption that because they haven't been changed for 9 years and reviewed, but they needed to be increased upwards, when actually not looking at the previous level, which was probably generous 9 years ago in terms of a limit of 50,000 a year as a household to qualify for social housing 9 years ago. And now for the 4-bedroom plus house, for the household income limit to be 75,000 a year, I think it's far too generous when we do have a housing list and actually people who are in much bigger need, I would think. And I would have thought that that type of household income, I know is enough to actually be able to have alternative housing options outside of social housing. I just think it's far, far too generous. On the flip side, page 56, and I expressed this concern as well, is the £286,000 limit, and that is being removed for people aged 55 or over. So my concern is those people who've retired, who haven't actually got any further income coming in from work, they haven't got the ability to work, and I'm worried about us discriminating against those people, because if you look at that 37,000 limit that we've got for a 1-bedroom property on page 55, if they were just purely drawing down that money would be gone in 6.5 years' time in terms of savings. So I know that they'll probably get, if they're retired through ill health and they've had access to a pension pot, or they've got and that's just their life savings. It's not going to go that far if they're going to have to go for private accommodation. So that really concerns me as well, and I've expressed that concern before. So that's of concern to me. On another point, I understand, I just wanted to ask about a good piece of the council's work. I understand there was a news story recently on the local news about a poor chap who was in Basildon Hospital, but he wasn't one of our residents. He was a resident elsewhere, I think it was Chelmsford, and he was actually he had an amputation, and he ended up being rehoused temporarily at short notice in Stansted. But I wanted to know and highlight our work on this in terms of amputees and people who find they've got a new housing need, and what the council does on that. So I'd just like to ask about that, because I think we have been doing good work in that area. Thank you.
Thank you for that. As he knows, he did raise this previously, and I did ask Miss O'Connell to send out all the figures and the rationale, and I'll let her, she can talk for herself in a minute. But all I would say is that obviously previously we had this 50k blanket limit, which I think was a bit out of date. I think it makes more sense to taper it, if you like, between the different size properties, etc. What I would say is, having reviewed Miss O'Connell's work, I am satisfied that she has come up with a scheme that is robustly defendable at the Housing Ombudsman, which is a very serious consideration, because the Housing Ombudsman in the last couple of years has really developed some teeth and is capable of levying quite hefty fines. So I think that I would generally agree that that particular one that he referred to, the 75,000 for 4-bed plus, I think that is quite generous. But as I say, looking at some of the recent cases from the Housing Ombudsman, I think it's a robustly defensible position. And I think if we were much less than that, I'm not sure how robustly defensible it would be. But I'll let Miss O'Connell come in and speak for herself.
Thank you, Councillor Schrader. I think what we've encouraged with the Ombudsman is to have a rationale that can be adapted. So we would look to review the rationale yearly. So if there are significant changes in things like interest rates, house prices and rental prices, which can all change up and down on variable economic factors, we will review that annually, and where we see a substantial change, we would bring that back for re-review to review those limits. So it would be an ever-changing area that we would review. So it isn't standard. It wouldn't stay if, you know, we had a sudden change in interest rates, if we had sudden changes in the house building programme, we would consider that within that, and that would be reflective of those. So it would be much more defendable. We did get our barrister to have a look at the limits against some of the cases that we have seen across the country, and he stated that it was very defendable in terms of that methodology. We have spoke to other authorities that have had similar levels that have been introduced during 21 and 22. And as you rightly said, you know, for some people they can find accommodation in that limit, and it is, most people are aspirational to do that rather than use social housing. Where we do have issues where there is gaps, and that's what we're concerned about at the moment, is we are having families that don't meet our income limits, but when we look at affordability within our private rental sector team, there's a void that they cannot afford. There is no affordability for them to enter that PRS sector, but they're also not able to reach on our social housing register. So there's a gap that people are falling into, and I think we don't want to be in that position as a council that we're getting ombudsman complaints around our affordability, and quite defendably they can come to us with our own evidence where we've assessed the PRS property and told a family that it's not affordable on their current salaries. And the allocation scheme is the bottom third of the market. So for both purchasing and rental properties, we have looked at that bottom third of the market. So that is very small areas in the borough. If there are people that are living near family in other more affluent areas of the borough, that gap would be even bigger. So we have done it on the lowest end. In terms of 286 limit removed, we would look for those people to meet the normal criteria of the housing register. We would want equity across that, so that is why we're doing that. And again, if people are moving through their pensions and, you know, their income becomes less, then we can reassess a housing application at any time as well. So as those situations change, we would reassess. But that is the reason why, because they wouldn't reach, you know, the normal standards that any other person would need to reach that resident. In terms of amputees, we're doing quite a significant piece of research with Essex County Council looking at supported housing needs, which is starting this year. I'm also quite integrated as a housing needs team with the ICB, the Integrated Care Board at Basildon Hospital, and I attend their care and review meetings. So yes, in some situations, we do need to put people in accessible hotels with wet rooms and such, while we look for suitable accommodation either in the private rental sector or through the housing register. And in some, you know, those hotels do have accessible areas, which is why we do use them. But we are integrated with our partners to find best opportunities for people, and we are looking at the future. So as a housing team, we're working very closely with Essex to project what our needs are, and amputees is something that is considered within that. Thank you.
Councillor Sullivan.
Thank you, Chairman. So the report says on page 51 is expected to be a 2 million spend on temporary accommodation, but that doesn't actually put it into context. A couple of years ago, we were spending, what, 700,000 or 800,000 a year on it. So you can see in just 2 years that has increased by multiples. And although it's related to housing, the expenditure of this actually comes out of the general fund. And of course, the general fund is financed by the council tax. And that means there is all that money is now not available for us to spend on other services that we would like to spend on the people of the borough. So it is a considerable financial problem for us. And also, of course, it's a recent phenomenon as well, as I've just alluded to. Only in the last couple of years has this really mushroomed in the way that it has done, and there's no sign of it abating either. So therefore, as we're going to have to deal with this for quite a while, we need to devise long-term changes to our housing allocation strategy. And although this scheme on its own will not deal with that budget pressure, hopefully I'm hoping that it's the first of many other initiatives that will come along to help us address this, because clearly it's not in anyone's interest that we have such a budget pressure, and as I said, it's taking away finance from other services we would like to spend on the borough. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Sullivan. You couldn't have mentioned that at a more timely point, and it's a good segue because Councillor Schreider has articulated this is the key driver. But the gusher is gushing, and this isn't going to put a cap on it. All it is actually reducing some of the pressure. And that's why I joined a posse last week with the Chief Executive, Mrs Skeet, and also the two MPs, Stephen Metcalfe and John Barron, to speak to the Minister with regard exactly to these issues. Not just from a Basildon point of view, but because leaders across Essex are all concerned about the impact of homelessness and the rising and out of control costs. And we presented a number of options that we would endorse the government considering. The Minister was very, very attentive and has actually said she's going to take things forward, and to make sure she does, both MPs have said that they will be writing both to her and the Treasury, because there are some ways that we could actually alleviate this in a major way, but it does require the government to take action, and certainly we will not be taking our eye off the ball on that, and we will continue to apply pressure to the Minister and the government to actually get some sort of resolution, preferably by the budget time in March from our point of view, although that might be expecting a lot from government to move so quick. But we will certainly be keeping the pressure on them to ensure that we do so to actually alleviate that pressure. Councillor Schreider, did you want to wind up?
Yeah, thank you, Leader. Yeah, just to follow on from what Councillor Sullivan was saying, the cost of the temporary accommodation is a major pressure on the general fund. As you alluded, our council is not in any way unique in this, and obviously I know you had a meeting the other day with the Housing Minister, Felicity Buchan, and I spoke recently at a housing summit that was hosted by the District Councils Network, and it was an incredibly well attended meeting, and basically all of the district level authorities are facing exactly the same pressures. I have to say us and Chelmsford are particularly badly affected, but it's all the district councils, not just in Essex but across the whole country, are all facing this same issue. And I think there is, as I said to Councillor Webb, there's only so many levers that we have available to us as a district council that we can pull to try and alleviate these problems. And I'm glad that you had the meeting with the Minister. The government do need to do something to address this. But as I said earlier, in the meantime, I think that this is part of a suite of measures that we're going to be bringing to Cabinet to try and relieve some of those pressures and defray some of the costs that poor Councillor Sullivan is having to deal with in the general fund budget. So, yeah, there you are. Thank you very much, Leader.
Thank you, Councillor Schreider. The recommendation is on page 52 of your agendas. All those in favour? Thank you, members. That is unanimous. We now move on to item 7, which is the exclusion of the public and press. We need to consider excluding the public and press from the meeting during consideration of the following items of business on the grounds that it is likely that, if members of the public and press were present during consideration of the items, there would be disclosure to them of exempt information as defined by paragraph 3 of Part 1 of Schedule 12A to Local Government Act 1972, and the public interest in maintaining this exemption outweighs the public interest in disclosing the information. So, I will put that to the vote. All those in favour of excluding the public and press? That is carried. I would like to thank the members of the public that have been here this evening and been, taking part. Thank you for coming, and we wish you the very best. And I'll say